40 years of China's opening and reform. I look back, remembering the changes. In 1981, I came here as a student. I became a lawyer and economist, working with China ever since. I advised foreign investors entering China and worked with the Chinese government, drafting the regulations that made it happen. In the 1990s, with globalization, I helped China reform state-owned enterprises, turning them into multinational corporations that would compete on the global stage. In the past decades, I advised on environmental policy that would help China become the world's leader on renewable energy. I have not just observed, but also participated in each stage of China's reform and opening. Now, it's time to tell the story of these past 40 years of reform and opening that has made China the global economy that it is today. It is not about looking back, but learning how we got here and looking toward the future that we will create together. Join me, Laurence Brahm, for China, 40 years of reform and opening, and marathon talks with behind-the-scenes stories from the experts and innovators who are the change that China will be. Hi, I'm Laurence Brahm.
I'm Shin.
And welcome to China Reform and Opening, 40 Years in Perspective.
Thank you for joining us in this special program. Today is the third episode of our live streaming marathon.
And today, what are we going to be talking about?
Today, we're going to talk about how China deals with social justice.
Social justice. Want me to tell you a story about social justice? Do you know that I was one of the occupiers at Occupy Wall Street in 2011 in New York City?
Well, what did you do there?
Well, we were occupying, the area where the bull was, and later they pushed us to Zuccotti Park because we were protesting for the rights and equality of the 99%, because so much capital and power was concentrated in only 1% of the people in America.
But wasn't that Bernie Sanders' main campaign?
That's right, that was. And now, fast forwarding today, it's 1% of 1% that controls most of the money and most of the power.
And that's a global issue. So that's what today's show is about, to close the gap between the rich and poor and to eliminate social injustice. So here's the introduction.
Rich and poor. The gap between them has intensified in almost every part of the world over the last 4 decades. Oxfam figures show some 82% of the money made last year went to the richest 1% of the global population. 42 individuals own the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the world, around 3.8 billion people. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. This has made the issue of inequality move up the political agenda. So what about China? What's the status of social equity here? And how is the Chinese government tackling it?
Yeah, Reform and Opening, 40 Years in Perspective, coming to you from the Kerry Hotel in Beijing. And you want to know the story behind this whole neighborhood here?
Yes.
Well, back in 1986, I was a young lawyer working at the Friendship Store over there in the Civic Building, drafting the construction contracts for the Shangri-La Hotel, which was the beginning of the development of this whole neighborhood we call the Central Business District.
Well, I think today here is the central of Beijing.
That's right, but in those days, everything was concentrated in Wangfujing and the Beijing Hotel. So people thought Robert Kwok, who was investing behind the Shangri-La and later Kerry Center, they said, why is he investing so far outside of Beijing?
Well, today now is the Central Business District. And I think a lot of our guests today are also working in this area.
Our guests are working in this area, and let's welcome them. These are the forces behind the Central Business District. And I'd like to begin by introducing Guan Anping, who is a lawyer in Beijing, and we worked together for many, many years. And Mary Peng, who is the founder of the Veterinary
International Center for Veterinary Services.
And Peter Ling van der Ras, who is with Scandinavian Eskenet and Banken, and Joseph Fung, who is a composer. And we're going to talk to our group today about social injustice and closing the gaps in China.
Yes.
Do you remember back in 1980s and early 90s, you and I were actually working here. It was a construction site, drafting contracts, right?
Yes. I also go to the contract side to handle some of the problem, the case. I mean, when the workers, they are having the dangers, they are give the shield to the court. So in that case, I handle this case, this side.
This side here.
Yes.
And I think actually our mentor, our mutual mentor, was a lawyer named Li Daoran.
Li Daoran is my leader.
He was your leader. And he was the director of, what was it, the Tiaofasi?
Tiaofasi, the section of the foreign investment section. She is the leader.
Right.
And it become my boss.
The Law and Treaty Department of MOFTEC. Those days it was called MOFTEC, right?
Yes, Great Wall Law Firm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Those days there was Ministry of Foreign Economic Trade and Cooperation. Today it's called the Ministry of Commerce, which says a lot about the transition of China.
Yes.
And you were first with their policy research unit, is that right?
Yes.
Under the ministry, is that right?
Yes. I have so many kind of the new policy. When the research after they set up to publish to the, it's a concern about the foreign law and concern about the trade and economics and the cooperation between the investor from the foreign countries and set up joint ventures, something like that. There's so many kind of the new regulations.
So you were working on some of the very earliest foreign investment in China and taking that investment right up to the present time.
Yes.
And Mary, I think that you were actually the founder of the very first international veterinarian clinic in Beijing or in China, is that right?
That's correct. Pretty much, I think, the first full-service international standard animal hospital, healthcare facility, and humane animal welfare resource center in China. We're a wholly foreign-owned enterprise here. We created the hospital in 2006, and it has really become a leader in terms of providing for our companion animals, our dogs, cats, rabbits, all the pets at home, that same level and standard of global best practice medicine. And we brought it to China in 2006, and we're very, very pleased because the industry has done nothing but grow and grow and grow.
Wow. And Peter, you're with Scandinavian Eskanalen Banken.
You're doing very well pronouncing that. It's not an easy job.
SEB. But I've had also a kind of long history with your bank because I was negotiating Ericsson's very first deal in China back, I guess it was 1992, and you were, of course, the financiers of that very early investment into telecom. But I think the Wallenberg group that's behind the bank and other Swedish companies has even a longer history with China.
Oh, much longer, both on the business side, but also one of the members of that family signed one of the first Swedish trade agreements with China in 1908 already, when he was ambassador to China. And there were also the first Ericsson sales to China already in the late 19th century, when we were selling the first telephone exchanges to Beijing, which were then used by the imperial court, among others. So it's a long history, and that has continued with a great engagement by both the bank and the Wallenberg family, which founded the bank more than 170 years ago, actually. So it's a long history with China and this family and the bank.
The imperial, so the emperor of China was once using an Ericsson phone, is that right?
Yeah, maybe he was a bit small to be making phone calls, but I'm sure some of his courtiers did.
Wow. And Joseph,
hi.
You've been on a lot of moments of China's modern history. We used to meet at every single ambassador cocktail party because you were like the celebrity for, or you still are, for years, composing music, even China's bid for the Olympics. You composed that music that was part of the bid that got China the 2008 Olympics. Is that right?
Yes. At the year of 2000, when Beijing was trying to bid to host the Olympics for 2008, we were against Kyoto, Paris, Toronto, and Istanbul. So there were 5 countries. We were one of them, but they were not sure whether they would become the first one because they failed in 1999, and they were trying to present something more traditional back then. So by the year 2000, they thought at the turn of the millennium, we have to do something new. So that we have to show it to the International Olympic Committee, China is moving forward, is forward-looking. So they asked me to do computer music for that presentation with computer graphics back then in the year 2000.
Wow. You know, the group, all of you, our guests today, are not just people who have been observing the change in China. They've been the people who've been making the change. They've been forces behind this transition. And we see in the news always the leadership and political meetings at the Great Hall of the People. But actually, the transformation of China over these 40 years is about people. It's people at all levels of the society who are in their professions who are making that change happen. And Mary, you just said something just now about animal health care on international standards. Now,
Yes.
when I came to China, I think you came to China a little before me, is that right?
Just a little bit.
I was
Little
81.
earlier.
What year were you?
I first came in 1980.
80, so you were 1 year earlier than me. Now, in those days, people getting medical treatment itself was an issue. I mean,
Yes.
there were pharmaceutical facilities. You went, there was nothing available. Now you're talking about world-class treatment for pets. What does it say about the transition that's taken place?
This is something that people, I think, around the world have tremendous difficulty trying to grasp. Even myself, who has been living, here in China for about 30 years, I am stunned on a daily basis at what is now available. We talk about human health. When we emerged from the Cultural Revolution, when we were coming out, of 10 years of a lot of turmoil at that time, the health system was basically non-existent. I think it's fair to say, right? I mean, we had barefoot doctors, but the hospitals were not running very well. One of the things that I research extensively, because with the animal health care sector, we are very much the vanguards of public health. We protect against infectious diseases that can be transmitted from the animals to the humans, what we call zoonoses, zoonotic diseases. And rabies is a very, very big area of this sort of preventative health care. From 1980 to 1990, I'll give you an example. 50,000 people in China died of rabies. 50,000 people died of rabies in those 10 years. And the primary reason for this type of high fatality rate is because our healthcare system was not functional. We had no rabies vaccines for the dogs, right, who were the causes of about 98% of the rabies deaths in this country. We had no vaccinations for the humans. China was not producing our own vaccines to inoculate humans who had been exposed to rabies. So this was a huge crisis in our country's history. And what had happened was that, people were very, very afraid of dogs, of cats, of animals that could be transmitters of disease. Now, cut to 30 years later, okay, to 2018. Animals have now firmly entrenched themselves as deeply beloved members of our family. Instead of being scared of dogs or cats because they could be harbingers of infection and rabies, right? They're now beloved family members. And like a child, we want to provide health care for them. The same way that we would take care of ourselves, we would take care of our parents, take care of our children, and to make sure that they live as long, healthy lives as is possible. That means now being able to give them preventative health care rather than waiting for disease to sneak up on us and to catch the whole family off guard. We bring them in for health care, for wellness examinations. We offer senior pet wellness examinations, right? The same that like I as a middle-aged person, or my father as a senior citizen, we provide for the other human family members. Now you can get MRI, for your dogs and cats.
Really?
There's CT scans. There's very high-end orthopedic surgeries. We're doing hip replacements for senior dogs who have hip and joint disease.
Really?
Yeah, really. It's mind-boggling, right? They're now bringing in equipment such as linear accelerators and gamma knife radiation therapy. And they're starting to look into that to develop these services for the animal health care. I find that to be quite stunning, right? Even as somebody who is in the sector, to look at these changes that have come about in such a short time. It really is such a short time. The small companion animal healthcare sector in China, as we know it, has really been around for maybe 20 years, 25 years. Right? So what you can see in a very short amount of time is always breathtaking in China.
So I remember there was a New York Times, I think he was a bureau chief or correspondent here, and he went back and he wrote a book about China called They Eat Puppies, Don't They? So I mean, isn't this creating a kind of a different perspective from the reality on the ground?
That is very much the case. Well, you know, there are pockets of the population, and also not just in China, but throughout the world, there are, you know, small pockets, I think, with a very deep traditional food culture, where animals that one country or culture might not, you know, be considered as food animals, they do, you know, consume. There are small pockets of the population that do consume dog and cat meat, but that is by far the minority. However, one of the things that we read about constantly, if you go online, if you read about the international news articles, I think it's sometimes blown out of proportion, and there's this erroneous perception that all Chinese people are eating dog meat 3 times a day, every day. And this could not be further from the truth. I mean, I have been here 30 years. I have many friends who are you know, Chinese. Never once in the entire time that I've been here has anyone ever suggested, hey, Mary, let's go out and have dog meat tonight. I actually don't know anyone that chooses to eat that type of meat. I don't know anybody that eats dog meat. I don't know anybody that eats cat meat. So the people that we are working with, the families that we're serving, love their pets. You know, I mean, they're children. They come in strollers. They come with matching outfits with their owners, especially after Chinese New Year. When the animal is sick, when you have a member of family who is ill and not well, the entire family is sick. You know, any of us who have dealt with a family member who's had an illness, the whole family is affected. We you know, regularly meet and welcome 3 generations of pet owners. The primary owners, the mom and dad, the grandparents come in, the children come in. Everybody is concerned. You get extended relatives that come in when the pet is sick. I've never seen so much love. I've never seen, you know, such deep, profound affection. And it makes me very happy, and it gives me tremendous optimism and hope for China's future as a humane, civilized society.
I'm going to try and pull that back and look at the economics behind it. Peter, you're a banker, investment banking, you've also been in many countries throughout the world, I think Brazil, many developing countries. In perspective, how much is this social transformation that Mary is talking about a function of income, rising income levels, and is there an emerging income gap, or is that something that China needs to worry about in the future?
Well, I think it's fascinating to listen to your story, but I also think that it's a sign, and the fact that there are people who can pay for CT scans for their pets and have that kind of qualified pet care is really amazing, but it's also a sign that there are people who can afford that type of very expensive treatment for their pets. And I guess that's also a bit reflective of the income distribution that has happened in China over these 40 years also, that and they're actually very coming from Scandinavia, where we have a very low our Gini coefficient. There's quite a not a very wide gap between the lowest earners and the highest earners, although we of course have quite wealthy people as well. And actually there would be very few people who would be able to pay for that type of treatment even in Sweden, because it's quite expensive. And I guess that is also reflective, of course, of the amazing economic development that China has seen, that we can see in the banking sector as well, which is almost a miracle to see how China has been pulled up and how very few really poor people there are in China. I think 40 million now below the poverty line, which is an amazing statistics. If you look at global statistics where the level of global poverty has been reduced greatly, it's really thanks to China that those numbers have improved so much. So it's, I'm very impressed as a banker to see that. But I can also see certain signs of that income distribution widening a lot.
Gini coefficient. As a banker, as an economist, can you explain to me how that is a measure of income or income inequality?
Well, it really shows, I think when you introduced this program, you were talking about the Occupy Wall Street, etc. And of course, how much of the resources go to a certain part of the population is, of course, a measure of how that income is distributed and how much the majority of the country can gain from that increase in income. And of course, it can also be a measure of social tension and some other problems as well. So if you can keep that distribution as narrow as possible, of course, without, of course, stopping innovation or making entrepreneurs work harder, etc., which is, of course, very, very important as well, because if you have no difference at all, that, as a banker, I certainly would not recommend that. That would really stymie growth as well. So, but it's of course a good balance that is the most desirable in that case.
That's why you would never see an Occupy Stockholm, because in the summertime everybody's out sailing their boats and having drinks outside. In the wintertime it's too cold. Shin, could you tell us a little bit about the Gini coefficient situation here in China?
Sure. So China has vowed to narrow its gap between rich and poor. And planners say the country is entering what they call a high-quality developmental stage. And here, a general report from the National Bureau of Statistics say the country, the income inequality still remains a serious problem, with last year's China's Gini coefficient sitting at 0.4. Well, Gini coefficient is a measure of the income inequality. It ranges between 0 and 1. The higher it goes, the larger the income imbalance. So for all these years, China's Gini coefficient has remained a little bit over the UN international alert line, which is 0.4, peaking in 2008, nearly 0.5. And for all these years, we can see only South Africa and Brazil have consistently ranked more imbalanced, with South Africa is 0.63, in Brazil 6.5, US is 0.41, and Germany is 0.3. And so after that, since then, China's number has dropped steadily, and the country has made it a mission to eliminate the gap between the rich and poor, and it made it its goal to eliminate poverty altogether by 2020.
Wow, you know, when I think back on the early days when we were bringing foreign investment into China, every time we were doing this, a major priority of the government, regardless of what city, what province, was how we could create jobs and create income through investment, because you know, this sort of the baseline of the economy was so low. And remember, seemed every time we did a joint venture, yes, back in those days, we were creating the law, because there was just, you know, a vacuum of legislation. Every time was a negotiation with not only the enterprise but the government to see what could be done, right?
Yes. For the very beginning, the first joint venture is concerned about the car. We set up at Beijing, you know. When the beginning, for the very younger, they are from the foreign country, they said the English very, very good. So the cooperation very good about 2 years. But after 2 years, you know, come from the country, they are just to control about the produce, you know. They are very familiar with the produce, but they are not very good for them to got idea how to Chinese to thinking, you know. In that case, the disputes already between the Chinese party and the foreign parties. So in this case, I just became the lawyer from the research institute, international research institute, belong to the Murphy Tech.
Right.
So first case for me to handle this dispute, to help them how to understand the contract. the terms of contract is, but according to the legal problems, it's according to the regulation issued by the Chinese government, you know. So I working time and time to with them. So it's very good for them to get along about 10 years, finish this program. And already, you know, at this time, past 20 years, more than 20 years, it's so many this kind of the joint ventures produce the car in China. So every kind of the car you can see in the road in China, and produce them to export the very good car to outside of China. So it's a very big chance for China.
You know, I think around the world, us lawyers are given unfair treatment. People don't like us lawyers around the world because I think we create a lot of disputes to make money out of it because we charge by the hour. But I think actually in the case of China, as lawyers, we were serving as a cultural bridge. In many ways, even more so than a legal bridge, because at that time, kind of the cultural communication was the gap, and the lawyers, you know, you and I were actually, you know, making that communication and getting things done, right?
For example, between you and me, we just said about the friendship beginning about the security knowledge. You know, before I meet you, I have been to give the lecture to the university about the security knowledge. So when we are meeting each other, they gave me the task. Can you to help me to hold the seminar about the security, to introduce about Hong Kong, the security, the situation, and the law
Stock
and regulation.
Market, regulation of the securities
So
industry.
we are joined to hold the seminar.
That's right.
At which hotel? Great Wall.
The Great Wall Hotel. We brought lawyers in from Hong Kong to talk about how you draft the listing prospectuses and all the documentation to turn state-owned enterprises into multinational corporations. That's what we were doing then. Wow. But you know, it's that cultural communication is so important. And Joseph, you are really China's ambassador of cultural communication. That's why you're at all the embassy events, you know, as a celebrity. Tell us about the need, the challenge to use culture in helping people understand each other, and also with China's rising incomes, the importance of culture in people's daily lives.
I think what China lacks is the lacking of information. Because prior to the year 2000, I think people were looking back to the year. They have 3,000 years of history, 5,000 years of history. So they were not looking forward. And then the government, I think, they were not trying to promote people to look into the future. I think the discrepancy in information, that's the importance. I think when young people nowadays get onto the internet, they know a lot more about the world, know about finance, know about culture. And of course, there was something that's blocked, but despite that, I mean, you have a lot more information now than before. So in that sense, the gap is narrowing. And when people know more, they know more about different cultures of the world, and know more about finance, know about everything that you can find in the internet. I think that bridges the gap a lot more.
This is a culture, 3,000 years, some say 5,000. Regardless, I think Chinese traditional music instruments, guzheng, guqin, erhu, all of this goes back thousands of years. But you're doing like high-tech electronic music. Is that saying something about the
Well,
changing
I
tastes?
actually do three things. I do. I also had a traditional music ensemble, which has all the prize-winning people from erhu players, the pipa player, yangqin, all that. So we do traditional music too, Chinese traditional music. But I always impart a very modern element into it. So I impart computer music with traditional instruments, and I ask international composers to write for them. So that was something new I did for traditional Chinese music. On the other hand, I do also orchestral music. So very contemporary avant-garde orchestral music I do. and I also conduct some traditional, classical music. But on the other hand, I think the future lies in computer music, because the computer evolves with human intelligence. And now we are looking into quantum computing. We're talking about AI, which is, I think, in the future, AI could learn everything about all the composing standards, theories. They can start composing for us, because you don't know how to compose music, but you like to send me a piece of music of yours, you don't know how to do it. So you get the help of AI. So in whichever style you want. Maybe Michael Jackson, maybe Beethoven, or a mixture of Beethoven and Michael Jackson, or something that nobody has heard of as your style. You just tell the AI, compose something that you don't know, because AI will know everything about all the composers, all the styles in the history. So that would open a completely new era of human consciousness.
China's leading on AI music. It's also leading on AI in many fields, I think also environment. And that also involves financing green and trying to correct some of the environmental problems that were an outcome of years of high growth and industrialization. As I recall, your bank, SEB, is actually a leader on global green finance, and we're behind the pioneering, if I'm correct, the very first green bond in the world. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. We did the first green bond together with the World Bank more than 7 years ago. And now being in China, it's of course very impressive to see that actually the world's second largest issuer of green bonds is China, right behind the US actually. And 2 years ago, China had the top place. That's happened in a very short period of time, and I believe that harnessing the financial community behind climate change is a very powerful tool. And it's interesting to note, if you look at the World Economic Forum, and they classify every year the 5 major risks identified by the global community. 10 years ago, those risks were mainly political. It was the Iraq problem and Iran and other political problems. Now, in the last version of this report, all the 5 major risk areas are linked to climate change, whether it's flooding or global warming, etc. That makes it even more important for everybody, also in the financial community, to make sure that all our investments go to sustainable projects, that if a real estate company makes an investment, that they make sure that the building is climate friendly, or that they are retrofitting a building to become more climate efficient using solar panels or triple glazing windows. And China has been really a leader in terms of defining and growing the green bond market, it's called. And now we're also seeing other bonds coming out, social bonds, poverty bonds, educational bonds, and even cultural bonds, actually. And I think it's fascinating to see what an important role China has played on a national level, but also on an international level, driving this important change. So I think that there's a lot of hope in that. And we also see now that the investors, the people who are saving for their pensions in their 20s or their 30s, they're demanding from the pension companies, the asset managers, that they invest in sustainable assets to make sure that their pensions are going to be, or the investments are going to be profitable also in a 30 or 40-year perspective when they will retire. And they don't want that money invested into a coal mine or a power plant that's going to be useless in 20 years, meaning that their savings will not be worth anything. So it's also very much of a bottom-up driven move that is changing, and it's really quite encouraging.
I want to pick up on something. You're talking about the financial sector being the force behind green economics. Now, I was at Occupy Wall Street, and we were down with the 1% because you're destroying the environment. Well, wait a second. Wall Street's destroying the environment. Yes, oil derivatives, too much quantitative easing being put into the wrong industries. America's back to coal. But how is finance being used as a driver to actually re-green China or many other parts of the world? Can you explain the technomics of that, how it works?
one thing that's encouraging, we see that asset managers are more or less $80 trillion, which is equivalent to global GDP, 1 year's production in the world, have signed up to the climate-friendly principles, meaning that they will encourage climate-friendly investments. And actually, in our own bank, we have retrained all our credit analysts, the people who look at all the projects for a loan, whether it be if you want to buy a house and finance that, or if it's a large company financing a new project, that they should always include climate and ESG, economic and social governance aspects into their credit evaluations, which will drive this move towards more green investments. And that goes not only for our bank. I think many banks, many institutions, financial system are moving towards that. And we have organized for the last couple of years here in China seminars together with different partners to promote that thinking. And I know that many of the Chinese banks are also now applying many more green principles in their credit decisions, which is really encouraging. Of course, we have to admit that the green bonds so far represent only 2% of all the bonds issued in the world, but that doesn't mean that into other credit decisions these climate aspects are also becoming an important part. So I think definitely the financial community is playing a much bigger role to move our society into a more climate-friendly stage.
Now, on the legal side, because all the joint ventures we were doing were heavy industry. We're talking automobiles, chemicals. Now suddenly, are you looking at more cases where you have to be addressing environmental issues in contracts and also what's being done in environmental legislation?
Yes. It's about, encouraged about the new energy. This kind of project is very good for, especially Beijing. I know Beijing very better. It's about 10 years ago, they set up the local regulations to control about the new energy to apply for the house and for everywhere. I take this one. It's the department and the house and for the this project is from the Japan. When they set up this project is for the Japanese investment in Beijing. Very convenient for them to live there and to use this building. But from very beginning, the economic is very slow. They can't make money. So it's their project is already finished, but they can't make money. So many the quantity, the money from the banks of the 6 banks from the Japan. They asked for the agriculture bank to give the guarantee responsibility. So the dispute is put by I handled this case. That is the old situations. It's don't to give any kind of new energy or the traditional energy. It's the traditional energy. But from now on, if the agriculture bank to support any building, they ask them how level of the new energy to use. The top one is the passive house. The passive house is already set up in Beijing. About more than 10 projects is to use the very high technology. It's original from the Sweden, and joined the 2 professors joined to study this kind of house. Is very good for the fresh air and for not to supply the energy from outside, but keep them very safe to supply the new energy for that house. It's very good.
So you're telling me that from a legal perspective, every time there's an investment going on, whether it's a foreign investment, local investment, there's a loan involved, that the banking system now is requiring new renewable or efficient energy systems for those developments. It's a legal requirement. Is that what you're telling me?
Yes.
Wow.
If they are ask some of the project to approve by the government, but beforehand you must give support about the new energy, how level. You know, the top level is Beijing. I know the Jing-Jing-Ji, Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei province very well. So top is the level is Beijing, and the second is Tianjin, and the third is for the level. I mean the level on the level of the used energy, new energy is Hebei. So different location for the different standard for that. If you are to set up some project, you must to meet the standard by each of the local government. So you can go to the project, set up the new project.
The Trump administration in America is trying to promote coal and fossil fuels, and here we've got the local governments and national governments all trying to promote new green energy systems. That says a lot about social justice on a broad scale. And when you think about it, when you have pollution, when you have contamination, when you have CO2, that goes into water supplies, contaminates water, water goes into agriculture, and we're back to the question of health security. And I mean, how much do you see from this new approach to ecological civilization, preventive health, as being, coming into the health system today?
This is something that has been ongoing. I mean, when I first arrived, in 1980 to just 1990 and then 2000, I saw the changes, every decade, and it was truly astounding. The country is trying so hard. You have 1.34 billion people, right? How to provide health care, how to deliver health care to all of these citizens, all of these individuals, right? So China has set up a state, provident fund through which employers as well as employees pay into themselves, right? But one of the key issues that we see, and this is as much a cultural change as much as it is a structural change in the healthcare system, we must place the emphasis on preventative healthcare. Whether it's human healthcare or animal healthcare, what we see today still is that there is an illness. Something is not right. Somebody doesn't feel well. We're going to the hospital because something's going on and there's a concern. By the time that this disease is diagnosed, the tests are run, and then there's a diagnostic that's given, it could already be quite serious or very dire. And this is the issue that we're seeing because it is a tremendous stress and a tremendous strain on the healthcare system, right? If we can just move that emphasis, and this has a lot to do with what all the other guests are saying in terms of communication, in terms of investment, in terms of legal reform, to be able to have the emphasis move from post-diagnostic, curative, and treatment, which is very expensive. If you think about someone who's diagnosed with 4th stage cancer, okay, whether it's a human or an animal, this is a tremendous cost to the individual patient, to the family, who often bankrupts itself, right, trying to find money if this family member does not have insurance or does not have adequate insurance, right? And then to go about, looking for treatments that can treat and hopefully extend the life of this family member. This is a tremendous strain on the current healthcare system, a tremendous burden on the system. And also in terms of mortality, if you can switch it from, post-diagnosis, end stage, final stage, to sort of early diagnosis, detection, you will be able to help the citizens live much longer. In animal health care, my sector, we don't have health insurance that could really cover a lot of these diseases, right, that we're seeing. Our animals are living longer because the families are taking much better care of them. And this means you've got cats that are 20, 22 years old, dogs that are 15 to 18 years old. Now, you never saw this 10 years ago. We're seeing this because we're taking much better care. But there's no health insurance right now for the pets. So this is a huge opportunity for the industry. And everything right now for the families is out of pocket. This is a constraint on the healthcare industry, because if you do not provide affordable care, then people will not be able to pursue and not be able to, try and give, whether they're animal family members or human family members, the opportunity, right, to seek this type of health care. It does come at a cost, and this is something I think collectively as a society we have to work on together. All of the various industries, the government, the healthcare, Ministry of Agriculture.
Education is a very important part of this, and how much is education being prioritized by Chinese families today? I mean, how much of it is a driving force now in addressing all of these social issues, whether it's environment, healthcare? I'd like to ask each of you to give me your view on that, education.
So education is very, I think education is a system problem. So some of the new area, they need to give the chance to try, But in China, the education system must change somewhere for the reform, I think. So in this case, is a concern so many kind of policy to put new policy to look forward in the future. But you said the situation, I think, is very good and very important for China to know the situations about between the animal and the people. So I already know the new knowledge from you. So,
Mary, education, what's your...
Well, I think education is the lifeblood. I think it is always the bedrock foundation of a society, of a civilized society. And, we do have to do more to bring some basic education to our children right now, who are basically our next generation. They will be the vanguards of this planet, the way I see it. I'm on the board of directors of the Jane Goodall Institute, and we have roots and shoots programs in more than 1,000 schools in China. We teach them environmental consciousness, awareness, and we really do teach the children that you are very powerful. Every individual counts. Your individual decisions from the moment you wake up in the morning to when you go to bed at night, what you choose to do throughout your day as a consumer, what you choose to use, if you're using, fossil fuels, if you're burning gasoline, if you are using non-recyclable materials, if you're not recycling. Your choices have tremendous impact. We have programs that we teach environmental awareness. We teach children, how to do home backyard composting and grow, little vegetable gardens. In one generation, we've gone from, people who mainly lived and created their livelihoods from being on the farm to children who have never seen a cow, never seen a chicken, have been completely removed, where they're growing up in these urban environments and they're on their, phones and, electronic gadgets all day, that they're removed from the actual physical world, the physical environment. And we've got to be able to remind ourselves that, our choices every day as consumers have tremendous impact in China as well as globally. Also education about, healthcare, basic things such as, immunizations, vaccinations for your children, for family members, but also for your pets. We're still battling a lot of erroneous perceptions in the human and as well as animal healthcare sectors. If a family wants to have a child, right, if they're planning on having a baby, having a family, the traditional logic was that the human doctor would tell the family, oh, well, if you're going to be getting pregnant, you're going to have a baby, you need to get rid of your dogs, you need to get rid of your cats, you need to get these animals out of your household. There is no scientific basis, especially now in this day and age, where you've got much better healthcare systems for both the humans and animals, for that sort of recommendation to be made. But we face it every day. You know, we have phone calls and WeChats and emails from families in tremendous distress because they've been told by the human healthcare provider that they have got to get rid of their animals because they're expecting a baby. And then because this information or this recommendation comes from a human doctor, everybody in this family says you've got to listen to the doctor. So the parents are giving pressure, the in-laws are giving pressure, the grandparents are giving pressure, everybody around this poor couple, and of course this expectant mother is giving them tremendous pressure to get rid of all the animals. Now, how does this affect us as a society? Because you're talking just this one family's decision, right? But here's how it works, because there is very much a domino effect. They get rid of their pet, and you have a country where we don't have a shelter system where you can just take an animal that you don't want to keep and relinquish it, right? We don't really have this system set up. So what are the choices? You can drive over to a place and open the car door and push the animal out, which is what we see. You can try and give it to other friends or somebody in the community. They may or may not keep the animal long term. And ultimately what we see is we see more and more of these animals hitting our streets. More and more of these animals are becoming abandoned. We're finding them in our communities and our neighborhoods. Once these animals who had a home lose their home, they lose access to good food. They lose access to health care. They lose access to shelter. They lose access to many things in their lives that kept them healthy. And they now become potential vectors of infectious disease. Worms, tapeworms, parasites, right? Skin infections like ringworm that can be transmitted to humans. Rabies infections that is absolutely, transmissible across species. We create a public health crisis that then comes back to haunt us as humans because of this lack of education and lack of knowledge. I mean, this is a very simple example. I could certainly go on. But this I see every day, and we've got to work together, I think, to focus more on one health. This is the animal healthcare sector and the human healthcare sector. We need to have laws and regulations against abandonment, right? Sure. Because there's absolutely no penalty, right?
This is an issue of laws and regulations on abandonment. We're going to ask Guan Ping to draft us something. But on the question of education, Peter, I believe you have 2 children here growing up.
3.
3, that's right. 3 kids here. And you're from Sweden, but they've also lived in a number of different countries because you've been posted around the world, developing countries. Tell me about your perspective through your children's eyes about education, the needs, the gaps, the crisis, if there is one, here in China. Do we need to have, better education for the future? Or we find that there's more European kids coming to China to study and more Chinese going overseas? What's the real story from someone who has 3 kids in school?
Yeah, well, from a parent of three kids, 14, 13, and 11, it's not an easy job, I can tell you. But my first impression is really coming from Scandinavia, and I think the global curse of the electronic devices, hits all the countries, unfortunately, and all the teenagers as well as adults, obviously. But my first impression is that focus and dedication to education is tremendous in China, and in Scandinavia we're not half that way in terms of the amount of time that Chinese children and also the families put into education. I think that's very impressive. Of course, then you can talk about different methods of education, how you should organize the system, and how much you should promote creativity as opposed to rote learning, etc. And I guess the educators don't really know where that balance is. Maybe there has to be some adjustments in the Chinese system in terms of what the focus of that education should be. And probably in Scandinavia as well, where we may have gone too far the other way, away from rote learning. And also, of course, the importance of areas that you mentioned in the environment, and not least also physical education, because it's all very important in these days of electronic devices that we make sure that our children are also physically active and don't get stuck either at their desks or in front of their mobiles or iPads or whatever. But I think that China is moving in the right direction. I think that it's also, from a financial viewpoint, I know that many of the foreign people working in the venture capital industry have invested quite a bit into the into the educational companies in China. And these have been quite good and profitable investments. It's an area that's growing a lot in China with many different actors in the private sector as well as in the public sector. And I think there's much being done and probably some calibration needed in terms of the focus of the different, at the different levels and also in terms of the type of learning. But my basic impression is still that I'm quite impressed by the focus of both the children and the families in China in terms of education.
You said something and hit on a nerve that I can relate to. I have 2 kids, as you know, as well, here growing up in China, and I think our audiences around the world, this electric device stuff, nobody talks about it. You go to a movie theater and this is a, G-rated, you can bring kids, or it's GP, you can bring them with parents, or parents can bring them, or you've got restricted or X, but these electric devices, I mean, there's so much violence. The music's violent, the language is violent. You can turn the thing on and, you have porn being thrown at you all the time. Should we start to regulate these things?
I personally definitely think that we should. And I think it's interesting to note that I have a sister living in Silicon Valley, in San Jose, in California. And I know that the schools where all these tech gurus send their kids, many of those schools don't allow any electric devices until the age of 13, 14. And really, and these are people who create their livelihood and spend the parents working with that 24/7, and they still recommend that their children should not be using it. So I think that's a sign that we should probably start restricting it. And I think it's in all countries, but I think maybe particularly in China. I mean, adults and kids are really glued to their devices, and I think it's sometimes I go to meetings at certain embassies where you're not allowed to bring in your mobile phones. So there's always a sign and there's a guard saying, well, please no mobile phones. And then when you enter the conference room, there are always, I would say, almost 50% to still start, WeChatting or something, despite the fact that you have to keep it in locker outside. So it's it seems like it's like please cut off your left hand before entering the room. It's that important to keep your mobile phone with you. So it's something both adults, but particularly kids, have to work.
So this whole group of, should we say, tech gurus in Silicon Valley, while they're actually opiating the world on electronics, they themselves are protecting their families from that addiction. Is that right?
Yeah.
Very interesting, Joseph, on the education side, you've dedicated a large part of your life to music education here in China and abroad. Can you tell us about education here and what needs to be done to improve, or what improvements have been made?
I think the most concern now in China is there are 3 things, okay? One is the ethics. I think China and Chinese people, there's so many of us here, and the environment depends on China. So I think the ethics in terms of towards the environment is important. The ethics of being not overspending. I think when you go to a restaurant, Chinese people will order whole big lumps of food, spilling over the table, and they left over a lot. So in terms of being very minimalistic in living, I think that has to be taught to people. Of course, Deng Xiaoping has catapulted China's economic growth, and they put economy first and everything else second or third. Now I think China needs a rebalancing. Economy is already going up, it's the second economy in the world, and of course there's still a lot of poor people. But in terms of money that could be spent in a family, I think if you go into a Beijing family, the people owns apartment that is worth about 10 million RMB, something like 1.2 million US dollars. So a lot of millionaires here already. So they really have to learn how to be frugal again. So that's in terms of the ethical side. The other side is when you go into a school in China, you're being fed with information. You are really an examination machine. You go and learn and you go through exam, and thereafter you hate that subject. And you don't learn, you don't know anything else apart from that. So what we need to know to educate people here is to question why, what, and all that. In terms of, as a composer, to learn how to write a piece of music, after we've composed a piece of music, there's no, when I reach my composition professor, we don't have any piano or anything, just a score in front of us. And what he did was to ask me questions. He never gave me answers. So that is a very important way to teach now, is to engage the students to know themselves. Yeah. So we are always being asked, well, could you do that some more elegantly? Is there a shorter way from A to B? You can do it better. So he was asking me, he was trying to teach myself, asked me to teach myself. So that's the best kind of teacher you can get. And China needs a lot more of that, I believe.
You've been a great teacher. And Shin, you're actually the youngest one among us. Why don't you give us your perspective on China's education system?
Well, I think education remains a top priority in most families in China, like you just said. But there is a significant imbalance in the educational resources in big cities such as Beijing. So parents are putting everything on the line to get their children into a reputable elementary school. This includes like spending big bucks to live in the right school district. And here we have a video to show the struggle in the name of education.
Living just across the street from her school, 4th grader Shin doesn't need to worry about being late. 3 years ago, her family moved here all the way across Beijing so Zhang could enroll in the Zhangguancun No. 2 elementary school, known as one of the capital's finest.
After I moved here, I made many friends. I'm very happy. I think the school is pretty good.
Zhang's parents and her baby sister now call this 3-bedroom apartment home, but not before paying 14 million yuan. That's about $2 million US. Their new place costs twice as much per square meter as their old one. They're now 7 million yuan in debt, while also sacrificing living space and financial security. Yet Zhang's father has no regrets.
We compared schools before moving here. The school cares about cultivating children's interests, provides many international exchange programs, expanding kids' horizons. Many students go on to enroll in good middle schools, so I think it's worthwhile.
Among Beijing's 16 districts, few have quality educational resources or a concentration of good schools. Zhang's district, Haidian, is one of the best. The number of select or key middle and elementary schools in Haidian doubles that of the Chaoyang district, where the family used to live. These schools also get preferential treatment.
China puts about 10 million yuan or even more into each key school every year. But for other schools, some only get a few million yuan. Sometimes there are no first-tier teachers in a school or a district, but some of the select schools recruit first-tier teachers from around the country, sometimes as many as 20 or 30.
But to get accepted to these key schools, children now need to live in the school's district. In 2015, the Chinese government announced stricter regulations on who could enroll where, and this triggered a boom in the housing market. Beijing is no exception. Big cities across the country face the same problem. The Chinese government recognizes the problem and is making big efforts to try and find an equitable solution.
Fairness and equality are the two themes of our reform. We mainly reach fairness in educational resources for compulsory schooling.
Some key schools are now creating branch schools or forming alliances with less sought-after schools, hoping to accommodate more students. Meanwhile, the government is also prohibiting real estate agencies from advertising school district housing in a bid to drive up prices, but that does not seem to have stopped the skyrocketing demand or prices in these highly desired neighborhoods.
Gender empowerment is so important here in China, and you know, with the educational system, it's women who are really driving much of that education system. Women are working during the day, they're coming back at night, they're teaching their kids, they're pushing, you know, we have a term here, tiger moms. But actually, from a legal perspective, how have the rights of women in China increased, or what restrictions have they been facing in their challenge for gender empowerment over these 40 years?
Yeah. The fairness is a concern about the education area. Is, you know, so many people, they have become the very good, use the good education chance. But, you know, in China, the very difference is the city and the outside of city. It's very different because very long history, they keep the fairness is already so many the goals on economics, they are focused on economic development. But the fairness in education, I think, is must give it more and more attention. So I find this problem from the very beginning. It's the security area. So I have been write down the very long paperwork. It's about 1999. I published the one about quantified justice. That's a new concept for to deal some of the security problem, and I think it both can use this concept and theory to the educations, to deal with education, to let some of the poor people to have the chance, so many chance to go to education, to go to the big city. So in my situations, I already write down some concern about how to give it a very good each area. I just take this one. Is concerned about the how to improve the party, the ability for the administration according to the law, and to use the quantified justice. And I want to introduce about new idea. It's already given by the top leaders, Xi Jinping. She just say exactly justice. You know. So the idea is the same idea, the same point, I think. So if they are put better to reform about party, government, every the system, you can use this idea and theory. It's good for education system to get better and better. Okay.
On a cultural perspective, Joseph, did gender empowerment begin in the West with Cleopatra and in China with Wu Zetian? What do you think?
Well, I think AI is going to empower everybody. Okay, so when that age comes, everybody, either you follow what AI is doing, but you can't follow them because they're so fast and they're so complicated. I don't think we could do anything that could be competing with AI in the future. So what we concern ourselves. We have to know whom we are. That's going to be very important. So we have to empower ourselves. Everybody, I think, has a diamond inside. And how do we polish that out? So teachers and friends have to encourage each other. Emotionally, we have to chat, and intellectually, we have to chat, and spiritually, I think we have to empower ourselves spiritually, because everything else done by AI in the future. So what we need to do is empower ourselves. Once we know who we are and the value that we have as a diamond, then we shine to the next neighbor. And here's another diamond, he shines to you. So then we share the whole group of diamonds. Yeah. Or we can go down the drain, of course. everybody gets freaked out because we don't have to do anything. So that could be another scenario. You can go, all the way up, or you can all the way down drain, and just drinking and being merry and lucky, go on the drugs. So we have to do something very positive to educate ourselves, to enrich ourselves.
Talking about diamonds, Mary's a diamond. I mean, she's probably the most gender-empowered people I know. I mean, you've been actually the founder of course, this International Veterinarian Center. You are a mover, shaker, a doer. In your experience, I mean, how many women are working in the center?
The majority, right? This is what is so fascinating about animal health care, and it's something that I try very hard to encourage, right? I'll give you some statistics. In the United States, 80% of the veterinary college students are women. 80%, wow. Right? Now, when you think of young girls, people traditionally think there's these stereotypes that you're going to pursue arts, music, you're going to be language majors, English majors, right? More hardcore stuff, STEM, the natural sciences. What I have found, what I have identified, is to reach out to young girls, young women, who perhaps never thought about pursuing these more what I call hardcore sciences, to be able to really go down that path, and it's driven by their love of animals. Isn't that wonderful? Right, so these interns, I have groups of young students. They're anywhere from like 9 years old to college age, and they come in and we share a common bond. We share this love of our animals, and they want to be able to find ways to help. So many times I've had these young kids in my hospital, or when I go to the schools to talk to them, they have these sort of aha moments where all of a sudden a light goes on, and it's like an epiphany. They never realized that they could create a career that could be, that could be financially viable, where you can make a very decent living, where you can also help on so many levels, and you can also spend your time with the animals that you love, that you grew up loving. I encourage girls, I encourage everyone, but especially the girls, to not be afraid of the math, not be afraid of physics, calculus, biology, chemistry. It will come very naturally because there's a goal that you're trying to achieve, and this is a way to facilitate your career goals. So this whole healthcare, right, animal healthcare, and the love of the animals has propelled an entire generation to pursue careers as veterinarians, as scientists. I think it's fabulous, and I encourage it all the time. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, if a child's parent found out that they wanted to be a vet, they wanted to be a veterinarian, the mother would cry, the father would threaten to disown them, because there was just absolutely, no social stature or status. There was no money. Veterinarians were people that sort of, traipsed around the farm with their arms up the butts of a cow, trying to help birth it, or dealing with very dirty, muddy, unsanitary conditions. And people were terrified that you would have a member of your family engaged in this type of, profession, and to bring whatever diseases or bacteria or, worms and parasites into your home. Now it's changed completely. My industry, the animal healthcare sector, is growing at a compounded annual growth rate of about 4 times GDP. It's growing about 20% a year, right? Compounded annual growth rate. That is mind-boggling. How many sectors, right? No offense, including green energy and everything else. How many sectors are growing at these high double-digit numbers like that? We don't have enough veterinarians in our industry to serve all of the families and their pets. There's a huge shortage. So I speak to all the young people out there. If you love pets, you love animals, you want to have a lifelong, deeply enriching, rewarding career, and you can also make money. Join us, right? Think about coming into the healthcare sector. Think about coming into the animal healthcare sector. It's a huge opportunity, and you can spend, your life doing something that you really love and you can do good, you know, help contribute to one health, and you know, be able to cultivate a more humane society.
Peter, you're from Sweden. Scandinavia has been the leader not only in green finance, green awareness throughout the world, pioneering renewable energy, but I also believe that your part of the world are leaders on gender empowerment.
I believe so, yes. We actually, now we have a government which is on its way out probably, but which has a perfect balance, 50% women and 50% men in the cabinet. And it's more or less the same in parliament. In the sector, in the business sector, unfortunately, if we look at the CEOs of the listed companies, it's unfortunately still around less than 20% women. But in government, it's a very equal balance. And if you look at universities, which I guess is the future, then it's like you said, it's about 70% women. And even at high school level, if you look at the most competitive high schools in Sweden, you need to apply on your grades from 9th grade to get into 10th grade. And the best schools in Stockholm have become almost girls' schools. There are very few boys there because and that may also be a problem with the educational system, that it's now less suited, some say, to boys than it is to girls, being more project-oriented, more independent. And we all know that girls are much better organized and probably self-disciplined better than, at least at that point in time.
Certainly in the medical sector, so.
Right. Maybe when I look at picture from the Party Congress, for instance, in China, there seems to be a slight imbalance in terms of gender equality. But if I look in my work environment and meeting clients, everybody, I think I meet a lot of women in very senior positions in China. So I think in certain sectors, women have certainly moved along a lot, and I know that the working population in China peaked in 2012. So of course it's important to use that all those two parts of the population, both the female and male, to make sure that the country keeps growing and moving forward. And that's, with China aging, etc., it's going to be even more important to empower women. And I think that in terms of Scandinavia, it's been a very successful and has helped our growth a lot.
That's right. Even on our program tonight, or today, I'm a minority. Actually, the key programmers are all women. The director, the producer, and of course, Shin, what are you going to tell us about women empowerment in China and some of the changes?
You know, a group of data recently becomes really popular on Chinese social media. The figures was back in 2010, but it still shows some really good points. So this is the international labor comparison according to U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and International Labor Office. And we can see the bubbles here. Each bubble represents the size of the labor force for that country. And we can see China and India actually have the largest workforces. And China has the highest labor participation rate. It's about 76%. And Brazil is the second, about 70%, in United States about 65%, in India is the lowest, about 55%. And this actually shows the labor force participation rate by gender. And we can see all those highest participation rates for men are from those emerging large economies like Brazil, Mexico, India, and China. China is about 80%. And China also has the highest women's participation rate, about 70. It's nearly 70%, while the rate for India is only 28%. And China's women's participation rate is even higher than some countries' men's participation rate. So that's incredible, and it actually shows in this aspect that China has a relatively low gender gap.
Mao Zedong once said, women hold up half of heaven. It sounds like in China they're holding up a lot more these days. And really, if you're looking ahead at some of the things that need to be done, you know, we're talking about the improvements in law, healthcare, finance, green, environment, and culture. But in terms of social justice, in terms of closing the income gaps, in terms of improving people's lives, improving healthcare, what needs to be done? Not looking back 40 years. Let's look ahead 40 years. Tell me, on the legal sector, what needs to happen in China?
Yeah, for the entertainment industry, it's already happened a big case. It's already the very famous, it's Fan Bingbing. Yeah. She's concerned about the taxi case. Yeah. And the one contract is used to handle to the tax bureau, and another is keep inside, conceal it. Yeah,
like a contract.
Yeah, that is unfair. Very, some people are very angry because they make money, big quantity.
She used to play Wu Zetian in a few films, right?
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Okay.
It's her. I think it's her. Yeah. So in the the government to control about the housing department and step control of the market about the housing. I already to know this area for many years. At 1994, my law firm to hold the seminar, with some top leaders to give some answer about this area, how to make the fairness. But
fair pricing for housing because of inflationary factors that are creating, or even, as you mentioned, back-to-back contracts. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. But very serious, the problem, is I just saw a case already finished by the supervisor. I mean the Beijing Tax Bureau. They will give the correct answer about this case. They also use the contract to find the lower price to handle to the tax bureau, and use the price the contract to handle to the bank. The bank, to get more and more mortgage. So it's cheating, And this case is a delay about 6 years. They gave last the decision, but it's wrong. And to put the top leader of the Beijing government is Tax Bureau of Beijing Legal Department. They gave the correct answer. They ordered them to revoke again, renew this case to put this kind of very, they make money about 1.5 million for between the low and high price. It's 5,000 renminbi each square between the low and high price. So in that case, it can get more and more money from the loan and mortgage. So in this case, maybe the district bureau working again to give the case the correct answer. I think maybe in the future. So I think is the fairness and the justice is very difficult for China, because they want to quantity goals, change the quantity goals to for GDP into the quality goals way is very difficult. I think it's a very big country. Everything is very to do to give the better system of legal system, and especially concerned about we are talking each area,
Mary, healthcare. You've brought a lot of healthcare a long way, but I'm sure there's a long way to go. What does China need to do?
Yeah, we need to look at encouraging, all right? Let's talk a little bit going back to education and gender equality. Encourage your daughters as much as you encourage your sons. Educate your daughters, right? Put the emphasis on them as well. Don't think that, well, I only have a daughter, therefore, I'm not going to spend as much effort. She could be the primary breadwinner of your family. Okay, so put the emphasis on both both sexes, whether it's a son or a daughter, and encourage your daughters to pursue careers that she may not have thought of. Healthcare, animal healthcare is a huge sector. We need the best and brightest talent, in this sector very urgently because of the growing human population, the growing animal population. We don't have enough clinicians, either human MDs or DVMs, doctors of veterinary medicine, and we need that tremendously. What we need in terms of a public health social justice is right now, because of the fear of infectious diseases, the fear of rabies, you read every so often about these, very cruel, very brutal dog culls, where there's a rabies outbreak in a region, and then they'll slaughter anywhere from 5,000 to 50,000 dogs. And a lot of these animals are rabies-vaccinated pets of families who get caught up in these huge culls, and their lives are lost. This doesn't have to be. This is really a big area of social justice that's only going to become bigger because there are more and more pet owners who feel that this is just absolutely ridiculous. It's not science-based, and it really doesn't help this society. The way to address this is to be able to provide, I believe, universal rabies vaccinations for any dog, any cat that comes into any animal health care facility. And if they're over 90 days old, allow us to rabies vaccinate them. Give us the funding. I'll give a suggestion as to where some of this funding may come from. All the dogs are required to be legally licensed in China.
That's right.
Lawrence, you have dogs, right?
That's
you
right.
have a dog.
Yes. Yep.
And we're supposed to register, our dogs. The first year registration in Beijing is 1,000 renminbi. The second year and every year thereafter, you have to pay 500 renminbi to register your dog. Now,
Right.
it can be a little lower if you go to the outskirts, but, let's say on average. Well, what do we use that money for, and why don't we use that money and give it back to society? Let's put this into universal rabies vaccination programs for any dog, any cat, because these are the two main mammals that can then, become infected with rabies, that can then infect humans and other animals with rabies. So let's try and put a stop to that. Let's take that money from the dog licensing fees and reinvest that. Purchase vaccines. Rabies vaccination is going to cost 80 renminbi, right? And then therefore give those vaccines to legally registered animal vaccination hospitals, and then we will go and vaccinate any dog or cat, no questions asked. And then you can really get a grip on this whole, rabies epidemic, or these, very high prevalence of rabies. Let's not forget, China's ranked worldwide #2 in terms of the highest rabies fatalities, right?
Wow.
This is WHO, CDC numbers. We're ranked #2 still. So we still have a lot of work to do. So I think in terms of balancing some of the social injustices, if we put the correct emphasis on the animals that are most at risk, which is our dogs and our cats, then we also protect ourselves. We protect our children, we protect our families, we protect the community, right? So this is one of my suggestions about how we can try and balance out some of the social injustices.
Bringing a cyclical economy into healthcare. And the cyclical economy concept actually came from Europe. And Peter, you're also, I believe, in addition to being the country rep for SEB and the Wallenberg Group, you are also the chair of the European Commission's chamber in Beijing's Special Working Group on Finance and Securities. Now,
Finance and banking, yeah.
And banking. So from a European perspective, Europe is on the front line promoting human values, human rights, justice, gender empowerment, green. What does China need to do? It's still a long way ahead, right?
Right. Well, I think China is, of course, moving quickly in many of those areas that you mentioned. But I think the key word, and it's really what you were saying, is sustainability, and sustainability in all areas in terms of bringing in gender equality so we can use everybody's a diamond, like you said, and everybody can shine in their own way and being given the opportunities through education, etc. But also, which is another possible problem in China's sustainability in terms of not mortgaging our future with huge amounts of debt. Because if we keep indebting ourselves, and that, of course, not only goes for China, but also maybe for the US, which is now in a increasing debt in a time of a very fast-growing economy. But I think it's important not to make our children or grandchildren pay for our expenses today, not too much, which doesn't mean that you, of course, need to invest in infrastructure or sustainability in terms of cleaning up your air, cleaning up the water, which are long-term investments, of course. So I think sustainability in all its aspects, including what we mentioned, education, and infrastructure, making everything sustainable, which will make for a much healthier future. And I think that's also in the idea of the Chinese government, but needs to be applied at all sectors and all levels. And that's what we as Europeans are also trying to make our economies climate neutral as soon as possible, without causing too much havoc in the short term, but making sure that the pressure is kept on. And I think if we look at the electric car sector, where China is a leader, and many other sectors as solar power, etc. But in the global economy also making sure that the country is integrated and open to all these different factors. And as you said, I represent European banks within the European Chamber here in China. And of course, we also like to contribute, and the fact that foreign banks represent less than 2% of total assets in China, we think that we can do a lot more, and we like to assist China in this quest for sustainability and modernization as well. And I think we can contribute even more than we're doing today.
Europe led the Industrial Revolution and then led the Green Revolution, and here in China there's been this, 4 decades of heavy industry, high growth, and now turning to green growth. But Joseph, you mentioned something earlier. You talked about spirituality. Has there been too much emphasis on material wealth and not enough on spiritual wealth? And what does China need to do for the next generation in the future?
Well, I mean, just to continue what Peter was saying, I think the most urgent problem now is in the environment because of global warming. So apparently the scientists are telling us we only have 0.5 degrees more before we got on the no-return route. So before we are concerned with culture or any education, we better save ourselves first. So that's number one concern that we have to do. And all kinds of education that would, whether it's music, whether it's medicine or law, has to go back to the environment. Yeah. Number one, environment. Save ourselves first as human beings. Okay. And number two, you're talking about culture, because really 21st century culture is about the blending of technology and traditional culture, okay, or human consciousness. Okay. In terms of computer music, we are getting on very fast because with quantum computing and all that, because the computer music grows with human intelligence. And all the other arts too, like computer graphics. When you go into Hollywood movies now, you're really seeing the dreams. You're not seeing the reality. Because in the future, the dreams and the reality, they're almost 50-50. We don't always live in the reality now. We live half our lives now in the dreams. So in that sense, we have to grow spiritually. Because everything else, I think gradually AI would take over. With the 3D printing, our clothes will not be buying from the shop. And the laws will be done all by AI. Maybe doctors, you ask the AI, it knows everything about your whole body and everything, okay? And the climate, how it changes the body, okay? So in the future, we need to know ourselves more and to use the high technology to enhance ourselves. And we use high technology to communicate with each other. So in the future, computer music could be, or any form of culture, we're just thinking, well, okay, Peter, I've just finished with a symphony in my mind, more than 5G, okay, and you listen to it. You don't even need a utility, you know, a CD player or whatever. Television.
Is that good or bad?
I think it's good because you are closer to the human nature. Because the AI is bridging the gap for us. We could become a cyborg in the future. So,
Joseph, if it's you doing the composition for the symphony, it's not good, it's going to be great. And
yes.
you know, with AI and high tech, it's going to be the next generation that's going to be in control. And that means, Shin, back to you.
Well, back in 2016, China mapped out a plan to steer its population towards a healthier lifestyle. And it envisioned that the nation's life expectancy could reach 79 years of age by the year 2030. Yeah, so according to official figures, China is on track to meet this goal. And here's a video to explain.
The average life expectancy of a Chinese citizen has been climbing slowly yet steadily for almost 7 decades. Back in the 1950s, a person had a life expectancy of just 35 years. After years of economic stagnation and horrendous health conditions, the situation took a turn for the better towards the end of the decade. Medical care improved both in urban areas and the countryside. But then, in the 1970s, poverty swept across the nation. Despite this, the opening and reform period started in the late 70s, booming the economy and stimulating poverty alleviation efforts. Chinese people once again had hope for a better future. A decade later, the average life expectancy jumped to 66 years old. After ushering in the new millennium, many citizens in their 70s were still physically and mentally sound and contributed more to their communities than ever before. And in 2015, the average life expectancy hit 76, 5 years longer than the world average.
Thank you for joining us today at the Kerry Center, Central Business District, Beijing, for China Reform and Opening 40 years.
So we'll come back tomorrow with another topic. How competitive is China's technology?
So be with us tomorrow. Stay tuned.
Bye for now.